Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary Podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Viddich, Graham Greene, Mick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 202 of the Spybrary Podcast. We're recording this in between Christmas and New Year 2022. I hope you all had a fantastic holiday and you got lots of spy books under your tree or as a holiday gift, etc., etc. Now, it is that time of year. You've probably seen it. Best books of 2022. I've seen a few best espionage novels of 2022. A lot of the experts and book critics and reviewers are pulling their lists together. And of course, Spybrary is a by spy fans for spy fans production. So we're going to share today some of the best spy books, best spy novels of 2022, according to you, our Spybrary listeners and members of our Spybrary community. Now, I know I bang this drum quite a lot. If you haven't already and you want more spy book recommendations, or there's a spy book or spy TV series you really want to discuss, then you need to head over to our online community. There's almost 3,000 of us there. And today I'm going to share with you the recommendations from the group, okay? And you can find that at spybrary.com/community or on our show notes for today's episode, spybrary.com/202. And I asked listeners and community members two questions, right? Number one, what's the best spy book you have read that was published in 2022? And then I also asked, what is the best espionage novel you've read this year that was published before 2022? Because as we know, Tim Shipman wrote up the 125 best spy authors. He also shared with us, his favorites and where we should start. And I know many of us are reading books from yesteryear and we're only discovering them now. So that's why I wanted to break this into, ask two questions really, so we could find out what we liked that was published this year and the classics of last year. So there's going to be plenty of recommendations in this. I think everyone, whether you're a seasoned spy fiction reader or new to the genre, will think you'll find something to love on this list. So join us as we delve into the world of spies and secrets and discover the best books of 2022, the best spy books of 2022. All right, so let's kick this off with the man himself, Tim Shipman. He said that he can't separate Paul Viddich's The Matchmaker, A Spy in Berlin, and The Berlin Exchange by Joe Cannon. Both were hugely atmospheric, based on a fascinating premise grounded in fact, tight, taut, and packed an emotional punch. They're a short nose ahead of Mick Herron's Bad Actors, where Mick brilliantly tackled my world of politics. Some of his best writing. I'm about to do Simon Conway's The Survivor, and also excited about Tom Bradbury's Yesterday's Spy. So in typical Tim Shipman fashion, he can't just give us one book. He's given us a few there for his answer for this year. And we were really spoiled with Berlin books this year. I was in heaven with it all, with Viddich, Fessman, and Cannon. In terms of books that were published previously, Tim writes that he enjoyed getting to know Jonas Merrick in Gerald Seymour's The Crocodile Hunter, but nothing was better for me than a reread of Big Bear, Little Bear by David Brierley that was published in the early 80s, I think 81, whose work is reminiscent of both Viddich and Cannon. This really is a stone-cold spy classic, so thank you to Tim Shipman. Martin Paul says, I'm going to say Tom Bradbury and Yesterday's Spy as best spy book of 2022. It managed to be serious, but with a truly sad undertone. For the book before 2022, he says, I'm going for Frederick Forsyth's Day of the Jackal. Controversial, this one, if we can stretch the definition of spy novel, because although we know how it'll end, we still enjoy the ride. Peter Newman in the Highlands of Scotland said, for me, my best spy novel of 2022 is Mick Herron's Bad Actors. Not very original, I'm afraid, but an honourable mention for Conway's excellent The Survivor, which was a coin toss loser for the title. I didn't read an enormous amount of pre-22 spy fiction this year, but I think my vote would go to Paul Vidich's The Mercenary, which I enjoyed immensely. Steve Ritterman. Now, some of you will have heard Steve on a previous episode of Spybrary where he talked about his John le Carre collection of books. He says, difficult, but here goes. My favourite spy book published in 22 was Paul Vidich's The Matchmaker, a wonderful Cold War story told in lean, clean fashion, reminiscent of Ambler. It had everything I love about espionage fiction. So that's high praise coming from Steve Ritterman. He says, a number of contenders for best spy books read this year and published before, but I'm going with David McCloskey's Damascus Station, meaty and visceral. It put me into a world I know little about. If there's a better debut espionage novel out there, I've yet to read it. And you can check out our interview with author David McCloskey, the ex-CIA man. That's episode 173 of the Spybrary Podcast at spybrary.com/173. Again, all of these and links to all these books will be in the show notes. Peter Morgan says he didn't read a 2022 published spy book, but 2022 is the year I broke my Mick Herron duck, so I'll go with Slow Horses. Now, good choice, Peter. And Peter and I went to school together, so I haven't seen him many, many years. And he has an interesting sense of humor, does Peter. So I'm not surprised that he enjoys Herron's work. And I often read in our community people saying, hey, I read this Slow Horses that everyone's banging on about, and I kind of struggled with it. We all say, stick with the series because it definitely gets better. So if that's you, if you read Slow Horses and struggled with it and haven't read any more, go back, read it again and read the series. You can thank us later. Clarissa Aykroyd says, I'm only about 2/3 of the way through, but for best spy books in 2022, I will go with the ever excellent Mick Herron's Bad Actors. I haven't read a lot of spy books this year in general, but I had at least a couple of candidates for before 22. I'll go with the non-fiction The Red Web, about the internet and surveillance in Russia by our own Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan. Relevant, and even if you're somewhat knowledgeable in this area, will probably give you many angles you weren't aware of. So that's a non-fiction selection from Clarissa. Holly Khan, I can only answer question 2, but it's the best spy book I read that was published before 2022. It has to be Ben McIntyre's The Spy and the Traitor. It's a cliche, but it really does roll like a film and should be made into one. Thomas Peretti says, I can only answer number 2, but I got a lot of great reading inspiration from the Shipman Best Spy Author list. I would probably put The Soul of Victor Tronco just above A Firing Offense. 2 great books in the world of American espionage, which I hadn't enjoyed much of before this year, and I'm glad an Englishman pointed me in the right direction. Now, Tim has chastised us because he actually talked about The Soul of Victor Tronco a couple of years ago in his Dead Drop 5 episode. So I've ordered it. It's here. It's on my teetering on my to-be-read pile. I will be visiting that one in the new year, Tim. Joe Modilewski says Judas 62, Charles Cumming, which was published in the United States in 2022. And his second answer was The Tourist, Olin Steinhauer, published 2009. Mike Hassel-Shearer, Dan Fessman, Joseph Cannon, Paul Vidich. I'll go with a new guy, William Maz, The Bucharest Dossier. There's actually a really good interview with William Maz over at the Poison Pen podcast. Those guys do a great job, and I will add that to the show notes. So if you're intrigued by that book set in Romania, give that interview a go, and obviously pick up the book. The Kremlin Letter by Noel Ben. Very complicated, even on a second read. Blazej Gabura says, best spy book of 2022, Winter Work by Dan Fessman. I really like the theme of cleaning up after the Stasi. Also the family situation, if you can call it that, of the main character, added some psychological depth to the plot. Totally agree with you, Blazej. And Blazej's second pick, Our Man in Havana by Graham Greene. Neither before nor since have vacuum cleaners been more fun. Payne Harrison says that books previously published to 2022, The New Girl by Daniel Silva. Ted Smith is also championing winter work by Dan Fessman, and previous to 2022, The Sisters by Robert Littell. Giga Vac is recommending The Order by Daniel Silva. I think it's from 2022. I need to go and check that. And The Spy and the Traitor, another shout there for Ben McIntyre. Mark Lambert, I'm going with a couple of American spy novels. Number 1, Joseph Cannon's The Berlin Exchange, and number 2, Charles McCarry's The Last Supper. It started me on a bit of a McCarry run, currently wrapping up book 8 of the Paul Christopher series, Shelley's Heart. Mark, maybe we need to get you on the podcast to share more about that series, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't read any of them, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on those. Author Stephen England says, for this year I'd have to go with Bevan Roberts' Kingdom of Spies, an exceedingly entertaining look at the realities of espionage in an often overlooked corner of the war on terror. For before 2022, I'm torn between McCloskey's Damascus Station and Olin Steinhauer's All the Old Knives. They were both incredibly good, and I'm hard-pressed to pick between them. So, all right, Stephen, we'll let you have the two. Chris Luloff says, I've not read any from 2022, but I have to say the best book I've read this year is To the Lions by Holly Watt, published in 2019. Jeff Popple, best spy books of 2022. Very tricky to answer. I love that. Us Spybrarians are struggling with this. I think we'll struggle with it every year. He says, I thought that Fessman's Winter Works, Vidic's Matchmaker, and Bradbury's Yesterday's Spy were all great, but I think that Mick Herron's Bad Actors was my favorite. Before 2022 is also hard, as I've been rereading a number of old spy novels this year. McCarry's The Mianick Dossier, Greg Rucker's The Last Run, Porter's A Spy's Life, some of the early Dayton's, and others. On balance, I think it was Dayton's Yesterday's Spy. I also reread the 3 Nick Marston quasi-spy novels by Owen Seller and really enjoyed them. Matthew Bradford over at 00 Section blog and frequent Spybrary contributor says, I could be forgetting something crucial, but off the top of my head, my favorite 2022 spy novel was Cannon's The Berlin Exchange. I think it was my favorite Cannon book. Wow. Older books, again, I read a lot of great ones this year. Many thanks to Tim's Spy Authors list. But I think my favorite was probably Quilla Solitaire. I've been stretching this wonderful series for I think 16 years now, savoring it and not wanting it to end. Going in order, but slowly even rereading some of my favorite ones multiple times along the way. I am not a binger when it comes to book series I love. In my forward momentum, I finally entered the final 3 with this one, and it's the best in quite a while. Overall, I prefer the initial 10 books to what I think of as the second series that started in the mid-80s and put Quilla in all the titles. Those ones are all still great, just mostly not as great as the original run, but Solitaire was a real corker up there with Hall's best. That leaves one orphan, though. That doesn't quite fit into either category. Charles Cummings' Box 88 was published in 2021, but it didn't come out in America until January of this year. So I'm not sure which it counts as, but I loved it. I'm a big Cummings fan, and this was my favorite one since A Foreign Country. Can't wait to read the sequel, which just came out. Bob Gaburi says, the best books I read in 2022 are Damascus Station by David McCloskey and The Mercenary by Paul Vidic. Timothy Hardy, for best spy books published this year, it's a tough choice between Matchmaker by Paul Vidic and Bad Actors by Mick Herron. Loved the plot and exquisite writing in the former, but at this point in the Slow Horses series, I'm so invested in Herron's characters and humor that Bad Actors gets the slightest edge. For the pre-2022 book, Damascus Station by David McCloskey is an easy win. Hands down, one of the most exciting books I've read ever. Greatly anticipating McCloskey's next book. Now, I don't know how McCloskey is going to better or even equal Damascus Station. There is a lot of pressure on the boy to come up with anything near the quality of Damascus Station. It was such an epic first debut novel from him, but really excited to see what he can deliver, and can he deliver something of that quality. Lachlan Page says the best spy books of this year. Kingdom of Spies, another shout there for Bevan Roberts. Best spy book pre-2022. Box 88, Charles Cumming. Our friend in South Korea, Yogi Hu, says Sierra 6 by Mark Greaney. And previous to this year, Mexico Set by Len Dayton. Our man in Station O in Oslo, Norway, Carl Gunnar Ern, says, almost impossible to choose the best spy book in a year that's seen the publication of Matchmaker, Judas 62, With a Mind to Kill, Berlin Exchange, and Winter Work, which I have read, and with The Lunar Housewife and Bad Actors still in the to-be-read pile. For one who fancies Berlin as the location, it's been like Christmas all around. Cumming and Fessman are neck and neck in this round for me, but if the Berlin factor comes into play, the prize goes to Dan Fessman's Winter Work. The last one I read was Gerald Seymour's The Crocodile Hunter, but that was a 2021 publication, so not overtly old. Adam James says, the best spy books I read this year: Damascus Station, The Spanish Game by Charles Cumming, Slow Horses by Mick Herron, and Len Dayton's Berlin Game. 2022 was a big intro to the genre for me, and you've picked the cream of the crop there, Adam. Really happy to see that you've got Slow Horses and Berlin Game, and more recently Charles Cumming and David McCloskey. So you've read some crackers there, and it's I'm hoping that Spybrary was of great service to you in picking out these authors. Todd Wilkins, The Handler from MP Woodward. Not one I'm familiar with, so I'm going to have to go and do a bit of research on that one, Todd. Author James Stayskull says 2 spy books, each by First and Cannon: Foreign Correspondent, World at Night, Istanbul Passage, Leaving Berlin. Of course, I didn't read Shane's instructions. Well, he did used to work in intelligence, right? None were published in 2022. I just read them in 2022. I'm also a big fan of Damascus Station. Now, Samson Dayton, clearly not his real name, says, tough call between Winter Work, The Matchmaker, Judas 62, and Berlin Exchange, but a very slight edge to Cannon's Berlin Exchange, my second favorite Cannon book behind The Defectors. 2022 was the year I was introduced to Bernard Sampson. What a wonderful year it was. I flew through the 3 trilogies and it was glorious. Sampson is my favorite all-time spy. Len Dayton is my favorite author. Since I have to pick one, it has to be the first book, Berlin Game. Even though not really a spy thriller, my favorite non-Len Dayton book I read in 2022 was 5 Decembers by James Kestrel. Martin Reynolds says, in a year when I actually got a decent amount of reading done, Judas 62 by Charles Cumming. I hadn't read any Cumming before this. Thoroughly enjoyed the book, which I'll admit at the time of purchase was an impulse buy rather Spybrary guided. Number 2, The Stone Roses by Sarah Gainham, much inspired by the discussions in the build-up of classic authors discussed in Tim Shipman's Top 125 Spy Writers list. You can find that at spybrary.com/Tim's list. And its subsequent drip feed, I probably overpaid owing to the scarcity of the book in the UK. Finances aside, it's a great little thriller and was well worth the search. So there you go. If you're in used or secondhand bookstores and you see Stone Roses, jump on it, especially if it's at a decent price. That's the challenge with Tim's list. I think it's just pushed the prices up on all the books that he's referenced. Murali Murti says, I read only 2 spy novels published in 2022. Both absolutely not from mainstream authors. I love that. Come on, this is Spybrary. And honestly, don't know where the best is a rating I would give to either. However, both were certainly out of the box and unusual. Under Money by Jay Newman, Ace of Shadows by Balkrishna Kamath. So 2 that I have not read. So again, more for me to go and read up upon. Must relate an anecdote from the New Yorker feature on Under Money. It seems that the publisher sniffed and told Newman, needs more sex. So he added a couple of sex scenes. The publisher said, more spice. So Newman added a threesome scene. Newman's son went like, Dad, stop it. Then the publisher said, maybe there's too much sex. That's when Newman told him, F.O., it publishes as is now. Pre-2022, have started on Slow Horses and I'm enjoying it hugely. I'm experiencing a strange sensation. I'm finding it a little difficult to stop thinking like one of the elite a la JLC and to start thinking like one of the pros, although that's not the best description, I guess. And of course, reread very carefully this time the entire Carla trilogy, as some may have noticed my recent comments in the community reflect that. Andy Ways, Lasker says, the Cassandra Complex, Fraser Douglas. I'm still reading this, but it's such a great Cold War setting so far. Box 88, Charles Cumming on audiobook, a fun listen, contemporary take. I agree with you, Andy. I actually listened to Box 88 over the summer. I was doing renovations, right? And I was carting rubble and rubbish and God knows what else into a skip. Sorry, it's a dumpster in the US. And I listened to Box 88 that week, and it really did keep me company. And, the day kind of flew by because I was listening to an engaging story as I was doing this pretty boring work. So I recommend the audiobook. It's very well narrated, and maybe I will. And actually, it's just out. The second book, the Judas 62 book, is out on audiobook. It just came out just before Christmas, so I'll probably listen to it as well. All right. Chris Rawlings, for number 1, Best Spy Books of 2022, Winter Work by Dan Fessman. Probably edges it just over Berlin Exchange. I liked that Marcus Wolf was in it. Of course, Marcus Wolf, for those of you who don't know, was head of foreign intelligence in the DDR. While I finally got around to reading the first 3 Bernard Sampson books, and yes, they are something special. I may now be more in the Dayton rather than Le Carre camp. We'll be continuing soon with the rest of them. Our friend Ian Douglas, the one of the co-founders of the Hildebrand Facebook group, which we highly recommend, by the way, if you love all things James Bond, he says that Berlin Exchange was his favorite book of 2022. That's Joe Cannon. It's the only new book that I've read this year, but I enjoyed it immensely. Cold War Berlin always interests me, and this was a well-plotted, engaging story. Previous to 2022, he is championing From Russia with Love by Ian Fleming. One of Fleming's best, he writes, a tight story with strong, often dislikable characters, close to the classic film too. David Hardman. It was great to meet David Hardman for the first time. He came on to our Spybrary holiday virtual party, meetup, piss up, call it what you will. Thanks for coming, David. And he's fairly new to Spybrary. And he says, the only 22 spy novel I've read this year is The Partisan by Patrick Worrell. It's more of an assassin story, really. It was all right. I wasn't especially bowled over. Fair enough. But he cites Berlin Game by Len Dayton as the best work previous to 22. Although selecting the first novel is really a tribute to the entire series, you go, oh my God, at the end and know that you've been well set up for more intrigue to follow. David Clark says, the only spy fiction published in 22 that I managed to read is The Partisan by Patrick Worrell, which I enjoyed a lot. It's a very well written and accomplished debut novel, though it lost me a little in the middle. I'll definitely look out for future releases by the same author. Like many, I spent a lot of time reading the spy classics recommended on Spybrary. I particularly like Big Bear, Little Bear by David Brierley and Charlie Muffin by Brian Fremantle, which I've just finished. Always love a shout for Charlie Muffin. Great to see there. That's a book I highly recommend for Spybrarians as well. But he does say the pick of the year for me, however, is The Double Game by Dan Fessman. It's something of a love letter to the genre and has such an engaging, innovative plot. I rate it a must-read. Simon Chapman says, the best spy books published this year, The Survivor, Simon Conway, is a superb finale to a carefully described trilogy. There's so much to love about this. Strongly drawn characters, male and female, a clear sense of now, modern, exposing the fragilities of the complex networks we all depend on every day. Nuanced characters, example, Lee Chapeau would have been caricatured by JLC or Henry Porter. The latter is always worth rereading, especially Firefly. A couple of fabulous cooking scenes. I get the sense Mr. Conway is pretty good in the kitchen too. An unforgettable villain. Looking forward to what he does next. So Simon, are you a good chef? I know he's a listener to the show and he's also in our community as well. So we'll have to find out the answer to that one. Honorable mention to Judas 62, Charles Cumming. Of yesteryear, Tim Shipman has, as he has for so many, broadened my horizons and reduced my bank account. Dan Fessman is my favorite of the authors I hadn't come across before. Safe Houses is excellent. Tim didn't mention Murray Smith, who wrote some fantastic thrillers in the 90s. Do look out for his David Jardine books. P.S. I quite and astoundingly forgot that this was the year I met Modesty Blaise. Thank you, Tim, for introducing us. Richard Sambrook, the best spy book of 2022 for me would be Joseph Cannon's Berlin Exchange. I'm a sucker for Cold War Berlin. Nice to know I'm not the only one. About to start Damascus Station based on Spybrary recommendations. Otherwise, I enjoyed going back to Graham Greene's The Human Factor. I hadn't read it in 30 years. Again, that's a big Spybrary favorite, The Human Factor. All right, we're almost there. Ahmed Siddiqui says Damascus Station, David McCloskey, or The Matchmaker by Paul Vidic. He also enjoyed Atomsk. Carmichael Smith, also known as Cordwainer Smith, recommended on Spybrary in 2021 and finally got round to it earlier in spring. Like very little else, I've read bizarre, occasionally beautiful, and brilliant in its own way. Raj Basu says only pre-2022 books, Moonraker, Smiley's People, The Ipcris File, all of them are my favorites, hard to decide, so I mentioned all three. Thank you for everyone who sent in your spy book recommendations. You know, this is what the Spybrary community is all about, sharing books that maybe we weren't aware of, understanding what fellow spy fans are enjoying. And, you know, the whole goal of Spybrary is to put a good, decent spy read in your hands. So I'm going to finish up today's episode with my own recommendations. As Tim Shipman writes, we've been spoiled this year with top drawer spy writing. Regular listeners know that I love Cold War espionage novels set in Berlin, East Germany. And this year we really were treated to 3 thrillers set in the GDR with Berlin Exchange, The Matchmaker, and Winter Work. These have all been cited throughout this episode, right? They're all excellent reads. And I really thought long and hard about this one. And I did pick out Dan Fessman's Winter Work. And much of that was because he'd had included Marcus Wolf, and I like how that he wove him into the story. In conversation with Dan Fessman, I learned that he went to the compound where Milka lived. He went to Prendon, which is where Wolf and the top Stasi officers had their datchas. And that authenticity, came off the page for me as someone who studies the GDR. I have an entire library here of East German history books. So that for me really hit the notes. But ask me next week and you might get a different answer, because Vidic and Cannon's spy books of 2022 are books that really do join that august list of Cold War spy novels that I will reread. Now, as others have mentioned, Shipman's top 125 spy authors list has kept me busy tracking down and reading spy novels of yesteryear. And the real highlight for me is David Brierley's Big Bear, Little Bear, set in 1948 revolutionary Prague, the countryside of Czechoslovakia, London, and then, you guessed it, Berlin. Now, I've got much to say on Big Bear, Little Bear, and I'm going to record a brush pass on it. In fact, the highest compliment I can give it is I reread it just before Christmas, and on a second read, it's even better. So I'm going to share a brush pass with you soon. Just a bit of background on this. I first heard about Big Bear, Little Bear from our good friend Mike Ripley, who said it was a Len Dayton recommendation. I understand Len had found it in a used bookstore in LA, read it, loved it. Ripley loved it. Ripley loved it so much that he brought it out on his top-notch thriller publishing on Kindle, and you can get it on Kindle there. And what I would say is, if you're a fan of the more realistic Cold War spy story, then you really are in for a treat. And in fact, Big Bear, Little Bear may well have crept into my top 5 best spy novels ever written. David Brierley is in our community, by the way, and he's just released his first book in some time. I believe he's written a trilogy. We'll be finding out more about that on an upcoming episode of the show. David's agreed to come on Spybrary, and we'll have a good chat about that. But Big Bear, Little Bear is the find of the year for me. And I actually asked on our virtual meetup. It came across to me very much like Quilla in many ways, where the protagonist in Big Bear, Little Bear is surviving on his wits rather than weapons. I'll give you an example of that. He's on the run in Prague. Secret police are after him, so he, shacks up with a prostitute. He doesn't do the bizzo with her. He's basically paying her just to hold up in her flat. Things like that, really make the book for me, that he's using his wits and his guile to get out of some pretty tough situations. So that's it. Top 22 spy books of, I beg your pardon, the top spy books. I'm not used to doing monologues, right? So the best spy books of 2022. I'm really glad I asked that secondary question as well, because I know many of us are reading books from previous years. And now we got 2023. I'm excited to see what comes out next year. And we'll record these next year. We'll record, a similar episode with recommendations. And I would urge you, as I did at the top of the show, come join us in our online community. You just heard over the last, 20 minutes or so, some of the recommendations from our educated Spybrarians, and we have Spybrarians and they've been reading this stuff for decades, and others who are brand new to the genre, as we heard. So do come join us in the Spybrary community at spybrary.com/community. It just leaves me to say Happy New Year to you all. Please stay safe, and look forward to hearing from you during 2023 and hopefully seeing you out on the road. We have Spybrary meetups on occasion, and I'd love to see if you can come along to one of those. So Happy New Year from Spybrary.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary Podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.